So last class we completed the Dhyana shlokas. If you remember, the Dhyana shlokas were basically meant to offer our salutations to all the people who are involved in the making of Bhagavad Gita, you can say. The Lord, of course, Lord Krishna, who is the one who gave the Bhagavad Gita to the world. Sage Vyasa, who was the commentator, through whom Mahabharata happened and in which Bhagavad Gita also happened. So these are the two main people involved in the in Bhagavad Gita. Of course, without Arjuna, there could not have been Bhagavad Gita, because he was the cause for which Bhagavad Gita discourse happened. So he is also partly responsible. And we also offer our salutations to Mahabharata as well as Bhagavad Gita itself, because Bhagavad Gita is considered to be a mother. So we consider the Vedas as mother, and Bhagavad Gita is also, they say, the fifth Veda. So we offered our salutations to all these people before we go into the actual study of the Bhagavad Gita. So this is what we had seen, and probably we also give some indirect credit to Duryodhana, because without him the war would not have happened, and without the war Bhagavad Gita would not have happened. So though he is the villain, so like in movies, without the villain there is no movie. There cannot be a hero without a villain. So villain is an essential part of the movie. So though Duryodhana is the villain, he is also the cause for what happened. So ultimately everything, whatever happens, is for the good. So the war happened, which was not good, but because of the war Bhagavad Gita happened, which is good for everybody all over the world. So this is what we had seen in the last classes. 2 classes we covered the Dhyana shlokas. Now we enter into the study of the Bhagavad Gita itself. So we start with the first chapter, which is an introduction. The first chapter, there is no teaching, because the teaching happens only from the 11th verse of the second chapter. That is where Lord Krishna starts to give his teaching. But the first chapter, the introductory chapter, has its own relevance and importance. In fact, some of the great commentators, including Adi Shankara himself, skipped the commentary on the first chapter, because probably they thought that people who are ready to listen to the teaching, they are already mentally prepared. But all of us, we have to understand the basic need for this before we start going into the teaching. So the introductory chapter is called as Arjuna Vishada Yoga. So it is called Arjuna's sorrow. Now we should not get confused by the word yoga here, because it is not some type of yoga. Here the word yoga means a chapter. So in Sanskrit we should be very careful. That is why we need somebody to help us to understand, because in each context the meaning of the same word may be different. So normally we understand yoga as doing some asana or some pranayama, but here the word yoga is used as to mean a chapter. So this is the chapter of Arjuna's sorrow. Now, what was this sorrow because of which Bhagavad Gita happened? So, Arjuna's sorrow or Arjuna's problem is a universal problem. It is not something exclusive to Arjuna. That is why it is being presented to all of us. If it was only Arjuna's problem, why should we go through all this? Why should we understand his problem? Because once we understand that Arjuna's problem is also our problem, then we will appreciate the greatness of the teaching. So first is to identify the problem. Now, what is this problem? So basically, the first chapter introduces us to the problem, and there is a second benefit also of the first chapter, or a second thing which the first chapter tries to tell us is that teaching can happen only through a teacher. That is why Lord Krishna is the teacher and Arjuna is the student. So teaching doesn't happen on its own. This self-teaching may lead to disaster. So all our Shastras, all the Upanishads, it is always a dialogue between a teacher and a student. It is just to show that unless you have a traditional teacher who is well versed in the Shastras, who has understood the subject, it can lead to misunderstanding. So that is why we always try and learn from a traditional teacher. A traditional teacher is one who follows a lineage. So that is why the starting prayer, we acknowledge all the teachers. We start with Sadashiva Samarambham. So the first teacher is Lord Shiva. Shankaracharya Madhyamam. So somewhere down the line, Adi Shankara came. Asmadacharya. So we just trace the lineage to the present teacher. So it's a lineage. So whoever follows the lineage, they cannot go wrong. So that is why it is important to have a teacher who is following a particular system or a lineage. Now, why should there be a teacher? Somebody can say, I can read the Bhagavad Gita, I can understand it. Definitely you can read, but understanding requires some guidance. That is why even as I told earlier, when Lord Ganesha agreed to write the Mahabharata, he laid down a condition that Vyasa should not stop at any moment. And in turn, Vyasa had laid a condition that Ganesha should not write anything unless he understands it. So if you remember, Vyasa had incorporated a few verses where Ganesha had to think. So imagine if such verses we come across, if it took Ganesha itself, who is such a knowledgeable God, a few moments to understand, for us human beings, you can understand how we will be able to decipher those shlokas. So that is why it is important to follow a lineage. So that is why it emphasizes the need for a teacher when it comes to learning the Shastras. Now, having said that, now let us understand what is Arjuna's problem. The universal problem is called as samsara, which all of us are going through. Now, what is this samsara? Samsara is basically a combination of three diseases, you can say. So when we have a problem, the first is identification of the problem. If we have a disease, first is to find out what exactly is the disease before the treatment is given. So here our first job is to identify the disease that we have, and that disease is called as samsara. We may not be aware about the term samsara, but that is what we all have. And this samsara is a combination of 3 diseases. The first disease is called as raga. Now, raga is not the musical raga or the political raga. It is, raga means attachment. So basically here the first disease is called attachment. Now this attachment is something which can be to anything. It could be to other human beings, it could be to other beings around us, it could be to even objects, it could be to anything. Basically, attachment means dependence. Nowadays we are attached to our phones also. So without the phone we feel helpless. If we leave the phone and go somewhere, the moment we need something we start getting restless because the phone is not there. The battery goes off, we are helpless. So our attachment is not only to people. We are attached to our family members, we are attached to our parents, we are attached to our children. These attachments are there. But it is to attachment to other objects also. So we are attached to so many things around us, and in turn we become dependent on those. So attachment leads to dependence. So without depending on something, we cannot exist. Now, there is a difference between love and attachment. We may say, okay, I love my family, I love my whatever we depend on, we can say, but the basic difference is between love and attachment is, love is unconditional, attachment is conditional. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. That is attachment. And that is even within family members, even with friends, with so many people around us also. It is always a conditional attachment. So we sometimes term it as love, but strictly speaking, it is an attachment because it is conditional. Always there is some condition to that attachment. So this attachment, what happens? It leads to the next disease called shokaha. Shoka means basically sorrow. So what is sorrow? When something you depend on doesn't function the way you want it, it leads to disappointment, it leads to sorrow. If your family members don't agree with you, it leads to sorrow. When we lose near and dear ones, it leads to sorrow because we are strongly attached to them. So raga, attachment, leads to shoka, sorrow. So sorrow, even if we lose our phone also, it is sorrow. We become sad because all our data is there, all our numbers are there in that. So without that we feel helpless. So our dependence on things around is so much that if we are deprived of those things, it leads to sorrow. So this is the second disease which all of us have. And the third disease, which is called as moha. Moha basically means delusion. Now what is this delusion? When your sorrow takes over, your thinking becomes clouded. You don't think rationally, you don't think calmly, and when you don't think calmly, whatever decisions you take definitely cannot be right. So, raga, attachment, leads to shoka, sorrow, which in turn leads to moha, which is delusion. Now, delusion, when you are deluded, you may tend to even do things which are adharmic or what you are not supposed to do. So, ultimately, we may land up doing things which we are not supposed to do. Even man-made laws itself we may tend to break. But the universal laws we tend to forget when we are deluded. So this is basically the three diseases that haunt all of us. If somebody says, I don't have any of these problems, they may not need to study Bhagavad Gita. Because this samsara is a universal problem. So the whole idea of conveying this is to convey the fact that it is not just Arjuna's problem, it's a universal problem. The problem existed thousands of years back, the problem exists now, and this problem will continue to exist 10,000 years from now too, because it's a universal problem. There's no time, place, anything which is not which is free from this problem, you can say. So once we accept that this problem is as much as ours as Arjuna's, we then proceed to study the Bhagavad Gita, which is the solution for these problems. And what kind of a solution? It's a permanent solution. It's not a temporary solution. For example, sometimes the roads are bad, there are potholes, they fill some sand and some brick powder and all that, and they repair the road temporarily, but one heavy rain it washes away. So that's a very temporary solution. For a few days it may last. So all the problems we have, we seek temporary solutions which are bound to fail after some time, because they are not durable. So the permanent solution is offered by Bhagavad Gita. That is why it is called as it's a text for moksha, attaining moksha. So it is called Moksha Shastra. And moksha is nothing but freedom from this problem. So that is what Lord Krishna is going to tell Arjuna. And by telling Arjuna, he is also telling all of us how to solve this problem called samsara. Like I said, if somebody feels that these problems I don't have, maybe they don't need to study, they can probably give their own version of how to overcome this problem. So we are not looking at them, but almost all of us are afflicted with these three diseases. So now we have to find the solution for these problems which Lord Krishna is going to offer in the Bhagavad Gita. So Gita, by studying Gita, we are going to get psychological independence. It is not physical independence, because physically nobody can be independent. Physically we have to depend on others. Everybody has to depend on somebody else. We have to depend on the farmers for food. We have to depend on the service providers for our connection. We have to depend on our near and dear ones for so many things. So physical dependence cannot go away at any age or any time. So we have to accept that people say, oh, I am independent, I don't need anybody's this thing. Nobody can say that, because you are always dependent on somebody. When you eat food, you have to depend on the one who grows the food, the one who cooks the food. Even if you don't cook, if you go to a hotel, there also you depend on somebody who is cooking. So physical dependence can never go away, but psychological dependence can happen through the study of Bhagavad Gita. So this is the objective of the first chapter, to introduce us to the problem, because we are going to see in detail as Arjuna starts coming out with his problems. We will be able to identify those problems with our own problems. So that is going to happen. The first chapter also will introduce us to certain characters. In fact, we can look at the first chapter as a study in psychology also, because as we go by, we will see the psychology of certain characters in the Mahabharata. In fact, they say Mahabharata is the best book on psychology, because you can find people of all types and you can identify them with people with your own psychology and with the psychology of people around you. So as we start studying, we will also come across the mind behind certain characters. So with this background of the first chapter, now let us, with all the grace of Lord Krishna and Bhagavad Gita itself, let us first start the first chapter, the first verse of the first chapter. So if you have the text, you can just follow. So the first chapter is called Arjuna Vishada Yogaha. So we start with the first verse. Dhritarashtra uvacha dharma kshetre kurukshetre samaveta mamakah pandavaschaiva kimakurvata sanjaya. So now let us first understand the background of this verse. The verse starts with Dhritarashtra uvacha. Now normally we always offer a prayer before we start any text. So here, though Dhritarashtra is a character, Dhritarashtra means the one who sustains. Either a Rashtra can be a kingdom or it can be the whole world. So Dhritarashtra, there is an implied meaning that it is the sustainer of the world. Dhritarashtra, the one who sustains the world. So it can be also taken as an implied prayer, though it is not a direct prayer. Of course, Dhritarashtra is also the character who asks the first question. The first verse starts with a question from him. Now, before we actually understand the meaning of this verse, when the war happened, the two sides assembled together in front of each other and they were ready for war. Now, Vyasa had given a choice to Dhritarashtra. If he wanted to witness the war, he was willing to give him that special vision to see the war. But Dhritarashtra refused, because heart of heart he knew that he was not on the right side. His sons were not on the right side. So ultimately he knew they were going to be destroyed. So he preferred not to watch that. So in turn, the Divya Drishti was, or the divine vision was given to his minister Sanjaya. So it is like we are watching a match, India-Pakistan match. So the two sides have assembled and there is a live telecast. So even in the Mahabharata days there was live telecast. So Sanjaya was the commentator and Dhritarashtra, since he could not see, he was listening to what Sanjaya was conveying to him. So Sanjaya again was not supposed to be the minister because Vidura was the minister. But Dhritarashtra was not happy with Vidura because Vidura always spoke the truth. He gave him the proper guidance. But Dhritarashtra was not happy to listen to that. So that is why he appointed Sanjaya, who probably was more willing to go by what, or willing to say what Dhritarashtra wanted to listen rather than Vidura. So that is why Sanjaya was given that role of a minister. So here we can understand what kind of psychology Dhritarashtra had. So he didn't want to listen to what Vidura was saying because Vidura gave him the right guidance. So Vidura didn't want to be a part of this. So they say during the war he went off on a pilgrimage. So in his place Sanjaya became the minister. So the first verse, Dhritarashtra Uvacha. So Dhritarashtra asked Sanjaya, desiring to fight, what did my people and the Pandavas do assembled at Kurukshetra, which is Dharmakshetra? So first the venue is called, it happened in a place called Kurukshetra, which is even there nowadays. It is not very far from Delhi. And it is called Dharmakshetra because Dharmakshetra, you can probably say, is the land of Dharma, which is Bharat. So in Bharat Desha, in Kurukshetra, this war happened. So he is asking Sanjaya, the two armies have assembled to wage a war. What are my sons and the Pandavas doing? Now if you look at the way he questions, Mamaka means mine and the Pandavas. The Pandavas were as much his as Pandus because with the, in fact, once Pandu died, he was the father figure for the Pandavas also. But you can see his psychology here. He says mine and the Pandavas. So already you can see his way of thinking. So he thought only the Kauravas are his and the Pandavas are not his. So this comes from a deep jealousy towards the Pandavas because he knew they were with Dharma, he knew they were right, but he was blinded by his, not only he was physically blind, he was also mentally blind. So he was blinded by his attachment. So here we can directly see how attachment leads to sorrow and then leads to delusion. So his blind love for his son can be very obviously seen in this. So Dhritarashtra wanted to know what is happening. Now they have assembled for war, so definitely war is going to happen. But by asking this, he is also hoping that Pandavas at the last moment may withdraw, give the kingdom to his son and go off again into the forest. in his heart of heart, he was hoping they would do that. Otherwise, when they have assembled for war, what else did he expect them to do? So this shows the anxiety, this shows his blind love for his attachment towards his son. So the first verse just shows the blind king expressing his physical and mental blindness, both. We can see both from the way he has asked this question to Sanjaya. So that is the first verse. Now we will read the second verse. Sanjaya uvacha drishtva tu pandavanikam vyudam duryodhanastada acharyamupasangamya raja vachanam abravit. Now Sanjaya replies. Now, like I said, Sanjaya was not the original minister. He was appointed later once Vidura had withdrawn. So he says, seeing the army of the Pandavas in the battle, Duryodhana approached King Duryodhana approached his teacher Drona and said the following words. So this is the meaning of the verse. So here again you can see the mentality of Sanjaya. He wants to please Dhritarashtra. So he says King Duryodhana. So when you say King Duryodhana, he addresses Duryodhana as King Duryodhana. So that Dhritarashtra is pleased by listening to the word King Duryodhana, because Dhritarashtra's love for Duryodhana we all know. So he just wanted to please Dhritarashtra. So he addresses Duryodhana as King Duryodhana. So we can also see the mentality of Sanjaya. So in each verse we can also understand the psychology behind each of these people. So the two, he says Duryodhana sort of surveyed the army of the Pandavas, and then he approached his teacher Drona. So this is the meaning of the second verse. Now let us go to the third verse. Pashyetam Panduputranam Acharya Mahatim Chamum Vyudham Drupada Putrena Tava Shishyena Dhimata. So Duryodhana approaches Drona, his teacher. Now again, why did Duryodhana approach Drona in the first place? Because the commander-in-chief of the Kaurava army was Bhishma. Drona was only one of the warriors in the Kaurava army. So why did Duryodhana approach Drona instead of Bhishma? Again, we can try to understand the meaning behind this. Duryodhana knew that Bhishma was committed to the throne of Hastinapura because he had vowed that as long as he was alive, of course he also had the boon of Ichamrityu, he could die whenever he wanted. So as long as he would be committed to the throne of Hastinapura. So Bhishma had no choice but to go with whoever was sitting on that throne. So there was no doubt about Bhishma's loyalty. Though Bhishma knew that he was with Adharma, but he had to stick to his vow. But Duryodhana had doubts about Drona's mindset, because Drona was very fond of Arjuna. In fact, he also says, your pupil Drishtadyumna. Drishtadyumna was the commander-in-chief of the Pandava army, who also incidentally happened to be Drona's student. Again, there is a story behind this. So, basically, Duryodhana had a doubt about Drona's loyalty. So that is why he first chose to address Drona, just to pep him up and ensure that he fully participates with his full mind into the war. Now, about Drona, there is a why. That's why he brings in Drishtadyumna, who is the son of Drupada, who is also the brother of Draupadi. So Drupada's children are Draupadi and Drishtadyumna, and Drishtadyumna incidentally was born to kill Drona, which Drona also knew. So the story goes that Drupada and Drona were college mates, schoolmates. They lived in the same boarding school or Gurukula Vasam. So in those days, everybody went to boarding school, and it was open to people from all sections. There was no, nowadays you have boarding schools which are public schools, which are only accessible to the rich, like Lawrence School, Lovedale, or where they have to register even before a child is born. So that was not that kind of a boarding school. In those days, Gurukula Vasam was considered open to every people from all sections of the society. So Drupada was a prince and Drona was a simple Brahmin. Both of them studied together, and they were good friends. They became so close that Drupada told Drona, once I become the king of my kingdom, I will give you half my kingdom. So he was so close to Drona. Drona was also happy. So once they passed out of the Gurukula, they went about their own ways. Ultimately, when Drona ran into some financial problems or other problems, he remembered the promise given by his good friend Drupada. So he went to the kingdom of Drupada and reminded him about the boon or the promise he had made to give him half the kingdom. Drupada listened to him, and then he laughed. He said, do you think I'm a fool, or some such words. We don't know exactly what he told him, but he said that is some promise made in when we were young, so those don't hold good now. So I'm not just going to give you half a kingdom just because I promised at an age where I didn't even know what I was talking. So Drona came back empty-handed, but he felt very insulted. So then his whole mind was to take revenge on Drona. So as the story goes, he found the kingdom of the Kuru kingdom, so to say, and Bhishma appointed him as the tutor for all the princes, the Kauravas and the Pandavas. He became their guru. He trained them well. Then he used them to wage a war against Drupada, and they defeated Drupada, and he took half his kingdom and released Drupada, which was a great insult to Drupada. So Drupada again, always, even in those days, this battle of revenge was always there. So Drupada in turn wanted to take revenge on Drona. So he performed a yaga based on which he got two children, Draupadi and Drishtadyumna. Incidentally, Draupadi, he got married to the very same people who had defeated him in the war, because he knew their strength. And Drishtadyumna was trained to kill Drona. That was the purpose of his life. So imagine, somebody is born just to kill somebody else. And he was, but again, the rules those days, Drona trained Drishtadyumna, knowing very well he was born to kill him. So Drishtadyumna was also a student of Dronacharya. See the kind of background and the kind of link between all these people. So that is why Duryodhana first talks about Drishtadyumna, so that Drona gets agitated and he is ready for war. So that is why he addressed Drona and brought in Drishtadyumna just to stoke the fires in Drona's mind about the revenge or whatever was there involved in that. So this is what the whole purpose of addressing Drona was, to sort of give him that kick so that he would wake up and get ready for the war. So that is why he addressed So he says, look at this army assembled in front of you, which is being led by Drishtadyumna. So this was the first, though there is no separate, like the first verse was Dhritarashtra Uvacha, Dhritarashtra speaks. The second verse was Sanjay Uvacha. The third verse ideally should be Duryodhana Uvacha, because it was Duryodhana who spoke, but it is not given separately, so we have to add Duryodhana Uvacha, and he starts off with this statement. We will continue further in the next class.